Okay, here we go. So, hey everybody, I'm Claire Blunt. So today I'm going to talk about 5 things that I did that helped me get started on the second draft of my novel. Now, what I want to be talking about on my YouTube channel is the process of writing a second draft. If you're like me, getting the first draft done seemed impossible. It just seemed so unobtainable. I didn't really know what to do. I didn't really know if I was doing it right. You watch some people in their videos and they have these very oh, don't do this, make sure you plot your novel. Well, I basically totally pants the first half of my novel, and then the second half I did a very rough outline, just basically to get me from point, I guess, B to point C, if the beginning is A. Anyhow, once I completed the first draft, I felt very stuck. So I left my manuscript alone and just let it sit for a little while. So then when I came back to it, it was terrible. It was just really bad. Everyone talks about not doing any kind of very basic grammar line-by-line revision when you do have the first draft. However, the first thing I did was I went back and I actually just kind of did a very basic edit. I worked a little bit on dialogue, I worked a little bit on some of the grammar, not a ton, but just made it where I felt like I could actually read it and enjoy it. And while I did this first reread and did the very minor edits, I actually created a document where I would write down any thoughts that I had about them. I also did it chapter by chapter, so I would do a chapter, I would make notes about what I noticed, and so that was what I did first. I did a chapter by chapter edit, just going through with a reread, and I made notes and questions that I had about my own story. The second thing that I did, which I think I would recommend to anybody if you are going through your second draft, to start out with, I used flashcards, and I went through, I printed off my entire first draft, and I went through page by page, and I wrote out every scene, and then I just wrote out a very basic description of what the scene was, very short, and went through the entire manuscript and used flashcards to write out all the scenes. After I did that, I then took post-it notes, which I made notes on about how I could improve scenes or even replace them, which I found to be extremely just more of a starting point and not so stressful. Some people talk about having very detailed descriptions of scenes. I don't do that. I do very basic, just plot points, but I made the flashcards, and after I did that, I did create a document on my computer. Oh my gosh, that looks gross. I was hoping it wouldn't show up. Yeah, so I created a document on my computer where I did all the scenes. I just listed 1, 2, 3, and I wrote up very basic scenes, and then at the end of every scene I would write what question I wanted kind of created in the scene, in order to just give myself kind of at the beginning of the scene I present kind of a problem or circumstance. At the end of the scene I want that problem to be resolved, and then a new question to be in the reader's mind. So I went through and tried to at least kind of give myself a little idea of what the question could be. Now, I have, since I've started writing the second draft, discovered that I'm not always on point with that. So, you're gonna have to edit as you go through, but it's a great starting point. The third thing I did was I discovered that I had created a pretty, I guess, two-dimensional villain who really didn't have a lot of motivation. Actually, I felt like I didn't really know any of my characters. Even my main character, I found that he was very just two-dimensional. He really didn't pop, and and this was really frustrating and hard for me to admit to myself, but he was kind of a talking head. He had no real personality. I thought because I had described him physically, and that was something that I had done quite a bit of, that it would make his personality pop more, but I discovered that he really was just kind of just not a lot of depth to him. I didn't really know anything about his past. I had just written the very basic things, and even the things that I did know, I hadn't actually included in the manuscript. I had like a ton of stuff that I had developed about him, but I hadn't actually put any of it on the page. So I would recommend, if you're going through your second draft, be honest with yourself about your characters. You love them, you know them, but what is actually written on the page? So I had to go back and I made basically a document that I listed every single one of my characters, and I wrote what I knew about them and how I could better develop them and how I could give them things that would make them more unique and just someone that had like a lot of character traits. It's difficult to know what feels like a gimmick and what doesn't, and what is something that makes your character kind of unique and interesting but is not just a physical description. In the Percy Jackson books, there is Percy always is eating blue food. His mom makes it for him, but he also a lot of times will do it when he's out. He still is. It's a throwback to the fact that his dad is Poseidon. Spoiler if you haven't read it, but seriously, you should have read The Lightning Thief by now. I mean, where have you been? So it's kind of a throwback to the fact that, you know, obviously he's connected to the ocean, but it also shows a connection to his mom, the fact that she makes him blue food all the time, and just kind of becomes a quirk and a personality trait that Percy has. So I started looking for things like that in my character, things that were already there that I could pull out and develop more, and things that you know, I hadn't even put in and that I could incorporate in that would be not over the top, but something easily includable, and that would have not just be something, but actually have like meaning. So the fourth thing that I did was I actually went back through, because it's fantasy, there's a huge issue with trying to develop a fantasy world that is unique, but also not so far out that you're kind of like, what is going on? So I had to go back through to a lot of what I'd written and basically just make it where it made sense. The rules of magic or fantasy there always had to line up. There had to be consequences for magic, because if you're just having people throwing around magic and there's no consequences, there's really not going to be a lot of conflict, or, you know, then everybody's just doing magic, whatever. So there needed to be some kind of rhyme and reason to the magic system. So that's one thing I went back and developed, and that's actually something that still, honestly, as I'm writing the second draft, I'm discovering that I am kind of going over and improving as I go along. So that's something I'm still working on, and we'll probably talk more about how to build a magic system in the future. And then, so the fifth thing that I did was basically I had to include more characters. When I went over my second draft, I realized that I had maybe 5 reoccurring characters. Other than that, it was literally like my main character, his mom, and one other person. The other people really just popped in and out for very short periods of time. There wasn't really any kind of payoff with those relationships. They didn't really make sense. They weren't especially useful. And so I had to go back and realize that even in my book, I want my character to feel alone, but no man is an island, so there has to be things that are coming in. And so my main character, I had to go back through, and so I actually took any character that I had mentioned in my story, made a list of them, and then basically worked out how they could be incorporated more into the story, into the plot. So I would suggest, if you have, I had the problem of too few. If you have too many, I would just go through, and if you have too many, I would combine them and put them together. That was what I did with, I think, 1 or 2 of my characters. There was like a group of guys that were, I don't know what they were doing. They were just kids from school, and so I had to combine them into one character because they really didn't add benefit. Every character in your story needs to be adding something to the story, and so I had to go back through and be honest with myself about who actually added things, and if they weren't adding something, going and reworking it to see if they could add value, otherwise they really had to go. As well as making sure that those characters weren't super generic. Like I said, it's kind of hard to admit to yourself when your characters are super generic, but yeah, it sometimes happens. My main character's mother basically shows up in the kitchen making cookies in her first scene when I wrote the original book. Now, that's okay, but I also had her working at a diner. So I basically took very basic single mother vibe, put her in the kitchen, and created a stereotype that I don't necessarily agree with or think is realistic in this day and age. However, I did it without thinking and subconsciously, just created that as like a sort of a shortcut. So I did have to actually go back and correct that. So yeah. You gotta be careful about what kind of characters you've created and if they're actually something that you agree with or even want to portray in your story. As a recap, the first thing I did to get started on my second draft was minor edits to the original first draft manuscript, just going chapter by chapter, just to get a feel of my story and allow myself to still feel like I was being productive without having to make any huge changes. The second thing I did was I worked on plotting out all my scenes. I broke down the original scenes and then plotted out how to better write those scenes or to replace those scenes. The third thing I did was I broke down my characters and was honest with myself about if they were developed or not, and what I could do to make them more unique and interesting and make them pop on the page. And then the fourth thing I did was I developed the magic system. In your case, or anyone else's case, it could be that you need to work on consistency in your world building, and that is what I did as my fourth thing to work on getting started on my second draft. And the fifth thing I did was pulling out characters I already had and developing them and making sure that they were important to the story, and if not, just developing them more and how that they were actually going to hit with the story and with my main character. And those are my 5 tips and things I did to get started on my second draft. Please share in the comments below what you've done to get started on your second draft.